great hall falls silent as the dead Alpha King walks through the doors, his mate's hand in his. Hundreds of wolves stare in shock as he points to the ambassador backing toward the exit. How interesting that you'd try to flee the moment I returned from the grave. One might almost think you had something to hide. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The cabin door rattled against its frame as another gust tore through the valley, and Sarah Whitlock pressed her hand against the wood, like she could hold back the storm through sheer will. Outside, the blizzard had been raging for 3 days straight, turning the world into a wall of white that devoured everything beyond her porch. Inside, the fire was dying, and she was down to her last 2 logs. The winter of 1893 had come early to the Northern Territories, brutal and unforgiving in ways that even the old-timers hadn't predicted. Sarah had prepared as best she could, stocking her small cabin with enough supplies to last until spring, but she hadn't counted on this. A storm that seemed determined to bury the entire mountain range under snow and ice. She moved away from the door and added one of her precious remaining logs to the fire, watching the flames catch and spread with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Tomorrow she'd have to make a choice, burn the last log and face the cold, or venture out into the storm to gather more wood from the shed 30 yards behind the cabin. 30 yards that might as well be 30 miles in this weather. The wind howled again, and underneath it, Sarah heard something else, a sound that made every hair on her body stand on end. It was faint, almost lost in the storm's fury, but unmistakable once she'd registered it. Howling. Not the wind, but actual wolves, and they were close, far too close. Sarah grabbed the rifle from above the mantel, checking the chamber even though she knew it was loaded. She'd lived alone in these mountains for 2 years, ever since she'd walked away from her pack after refusing an arranged mating to a beta who'd made his contempt for her independence abundantly clear. The Silvercrest pack had given her a choice: accept Marcus Thornhill as her mate or leave the territory. She'd chosen freedom, and she'd never once regretted it, even on nights like this when isolation felt less like liberty and more like a death sentence. The howling came again, closer now, and Sarah moved to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass into the storm. At first she saw nothing but swirling snow, but then movement caught her eye, shapes emerging from the white, low to the ground, and moving with the unmistakable gait of wolves. Not shifters in wolf form, but actual wolves, and there were a lot of them. Sarah counted as they emerged from the storm, their forms becoming clearer as they approached the circle of light cast by her cabin windows. 7, 8, 9 wolves, all moving together, all heading straight for her porch. Her finger tightened on the rifle's trigger, but she didn't raise the weapon. Something was wrong with these wolves, something beyond the obvious fact that they were approaching a human dwelling instead of avoiding it. They weren't moving like predators on the hunt. They were stumbling, dragging themselves through the snow with obvious desperation. As the first wolf reached the edge of her porch, Sarah saw why, and her breath caught in her throat. They were starving, so emaciated that their ribs showed clearly even through their thick winter coats. Their eyes, normally bright and alert, were dull with exhaustion and hunger. These weren't dangerous predators. They were dying creatures seeking shelter from a storm that would kill them if they didn't find warmth soon. The lead wolf, a large male with dark gray fur matted with ice, collapsed on her porch, too weak to take another step. Behind him, the others followed suit, dropping where they stood, their sides heaving with labored breathing. Sarah stood at her window, frozen with indecision. Every practical instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to let nature take its course, to preserve her limited resources for her own survival. She had barely enough food to last the winter herself. She couldn't afford to feed a pack of starving wolves. But looking at those animals, at the resignation in their eyes as they lay down to die on her porch, she felt something crack open in her chest. She'd chosen isolation to escape the suffocating expectations of pack life, but she'd never stopped being an omega at her core. Her nature was to nurture, to protect, to care for those in need, even when it defied logic or self-preservation. The wind hammered against the cabin again, and Sarah watched the wolves shiver, their bodies curling tighter against the cold. 3 days they'd been out in this storm, she realized. 3 days without food or shelter, driven by desperation to approach a human dwelling. If she turned them away now, they'd be dead by morning, every single one of them. Sarah set down the rifle and moved to her small pantry, taking stock of what she had. Dried venison, smoked fish, a few precious tins of preserved meat she'd been saving. Enough to keep her fed until spring if she rationed carefully. Not enough if she started feeding 12 wolves, because that's what she'd counted now. 12 wolves, all dying on her porch. The practical voice in her head was shouting that this was suicide, that she'd starve herself trying to save creatures that couldn't be saved. But Sarah had spent 2 years learning to trust her instincts over the voices of others, and her instincts were screaming that this mattered, that these wolves mattered in ways she couldn't yet understand. She grabbed a canvas bag and started loading it with food, taking strips of dried meat, chunks of smoked fish, everything she could spare, and then some. When the bag was full, she pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and steeled herself for what she was about to do. The moment she opened the door, the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Snow blasted into the cabin, and Sarah had to throw her shoulder against the door to keep it from being torn from its hinges. The wolves on her porch didn't move, didn't react to her presence. They were too far gone, hovering on the edge of death, waiting for it to claim them. Sarah knelt beside the nearest wolf, a smaller female with silver-tipped fur, and pulled a strip of dried venison from her bag. She held it out cautiously, ready to pull back if the animal showed any signs of aggression. But the wolf simply opened its jaws weakly and took the meat, swallowing it without even chewing, too desperate to be cautious. One by one, Sarah moved through the pack, offering food to each wolf, watching as they devoured what she gave them with the desperation of creatures who'd been starving for far longer than 3 days. The large gray male who'd collapsed first ate last, and when Sarah knelt beside him, she saw intelligence in his eyes that made her pause. This wasn't a normal wolf, she realized with sudden certainty. This was a shifter, an alpha from the power she could feel radiating from him even in his weakened state. The others were shifters too, all of them. A pack that had gotten caught in the storm and been unable to shift back to human form, trapped by exhaustion and starvation in their wolf bodies. The gray male took the meat she offered, his eyes never leaving her face, and Sarah felt something pass between them. Gratitude, yes, but also recognition, as if he knew exactly what she was sacrificing to help them, as if he understood that feeding them might be signing her own death warrant. When the bag was empty and every wolf had been fed, Sarah stood and looked at the 12 creatures now watching her with something approaching hope in their eyes. She should go back inside now, close the door, let them survive the night on what she'd given them, and then move on in the morning when the storm broke. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But the storm showed no signs of breaking, and these wolves wouldn't last another day without shelter. Sarah looked at her small cabin, at the space that was barely large enough for one person, and made a decision that would change everything. She opened the door wide and stepped aside. For a moment, nothing happened. The wolves stared at the open door, at the warmth and light spilling out into the storm, as if they couldn't quite believe what she was offering. Then the gray male struggled to his feet, moving slowly, painfully, and limped through the door into the cabin. The others followed one by one, dragging themselves inside with the last of their strength. Sarah watched them enter, watched them collapse around her fireplace in a pile of exhausted fur and bone, and wondered what the hell she'd just done. She'd invited 12 starving wolves into her home, sacrificed a significant portion of her food stores, and quite possibly ensured her own death by starvation before spring arrived. The practical voice was screaming that she was an idiot, that this was exactly the kind of soft-hearted foolishness that had made her unsuitable for pack leadership in Silvercrest. But looking at the wolves now safe and warm around her fire, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years of isolation. Purpose, connection. The sense that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, even if she couldn't explain why. She closed the door against the storm, sealing them all inside together, and began the process of figuring out how to survive the winter with 12 unexpected guests. The first night was chaos. 12 wolves in a space meant for one human meant there was barely room to move. Sarah ended up sleeping sitting up in her chair by the fire, surrounded by a sea of fur and the sound of heavy breathing. Every time she dozed off, she'd jerk awake with panic, certain she'd made a fatal mistake, that one of the wolves would attack. But they never did. They simply slept, their bodies slowly warming, their breathing gradually becoming less labored. When dawn came gray and dim through the still raging storm, Sarah assessed her situation with a clearer head. The wolves were alive, which was good. They were also still starving, which was a problem. She had enough food left to feed herself for maybe 2 months if she rationed carefully. Trying to feed 13 beings would exhaust her supplies in weeks. She needed a plan, and she needed it quickly. The gray male was the first to wake, his amber eyes opening to watch Sarah as she moved around the cabin, taking inventory of her supplies. He didn't move from his position by the fire, but she could feel his attention on her, assessing, calculating. When she approached with more dried meat, he took it gently from her hand, and she saw something flicker in his eyes, shame, maybe, or guilt at accepting charity he couldn't repay. "You need to shift back," Sarah said quietly, knowing he could understand her even if he couldn't respond in wolf form. "All of you do. You'll die if you stay like this much longer." The wolf's ears flattened against his head, and Sarah saw the problem immediately. They couldn't shift. Starvation and exhaustion had left them too weak to make the transformation back to human form. Shifting required energy, a lot of it, and these wolves had nothing left to give. "Then we'll get you strong enough," Sarah said, making another decision that defied all logic. "I'll feed you, get your strength back, and when you can shift, we'll figure out the rest." She had no idea how she'd accomplish this, no idea if it was even possible. But she'd committed now, and Sarah Whitlock had never been the type to give up halfway through something, no matter how impossible it seemed. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Sarah would ration out food twice a day, giving the wolves just enough to keep them alive while desperately trying to preserve her dwindling stores. She'd venture out to the shed when the wind died down slightly, bringing back logs to keep the fire burning. She'd melt snow for water, check the wolves for injuries, and talk to them constantly, partly to stay sane and partly because she sensed they needed to hear a human voice, needed to remember they were more than just dying animals. The gray male, who Sarah had started calling Shadow in her mind, watched her constantly. He'd positioned himself closest to the door, between her and the outside world, a protective stance that suggested leadership even in his weakened state. The others deferred to him, waiting for him to eat first, following his lead in everything. This was an alpha, and his pack, Sarah realized, though what they were doing so far from any established territory remained a mystery. On the fourth day, something shifted. Sarah was sitting by the fire, mending a tear in her coat, when Shadow rose from his position and padded over to her. He'd gained a little weight, his ribs no longer quite so prominent, and there was more life in his eyes. He sat down directly in front of her, close enough that she could feel the heat from his body, and did something unexpected. He bowed his head and placed his paw on her knee, a gesture of respect and submission that took Sarah's breath away. Alphas didn't bow to anyone except those they deemed worthy of absolute respect. This wolf, this powerful alpha, who'd probably commanded dozens of shifters in his pack, was showing her deference. Sarah reached out slowly and placed her hand on his head, feeling the thick fur beneath her palm. "You're welcome," she whispered, understanding what he was trying to communicate. "I couldn't let you die out there." Shadow's eyes met hers, and in them Sarah saw gratitude so profound it made her throat tight. But she also saw something else: determination. He was going to survive this. His pack was going to survive. And when they did, when they were strong enough to shift back and leave this mountain, he would remember the Omega who'd saved them all. The storm finally broke on the seventh day, revealing a world buried under snow so deep that Sarah's cabin looked like a small island in an ocean of white. The temperature plummeted without the cloud cover, making it dangerous to be outside for more than a few minutes at a time. Sarah's food stores were critically low now. She'd stretched them as far as possible, but feeding 13 mouths had taken a toll she couldn't ignore. If the wolves didn't regain enough strength to shift soon, they were all going to starve. She was sitting at her small table, trying to calculate how many more days she could keep them all alive, when she felt it. A surge of energy that made the air in the cabin crackle like lightning. Sarah looked up to see Shadow standing in the center of the room, his body beginning to shimmer with the unmistakable signs of an approaching shift. The other wolves lifted their heads, watching their alpha with hope in their eyes. Shadow's transformation was slow and clearly painful, his body fighting against the change after so long in wolf form. But gradually, fur receded, bones restructured, and the massive gray wolf became a man. He was tall, powerfully built even in his emaciated state, with dark hair shot through with silver and features that suggested both strength and intelligence. But it was his eyes that held Sarah's attention, the same amber color they'd been in wolf form, now looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough from disuse but carrying an authority that made it clear this man was used to being obeyed. "For everything. You saved our lives." Sarah stood slowly, suddenly very aware that she was alone in her cabin with a naked alpha male. She grabbed a blanket from her bed and held it out to him, carefully keeping her eyes on his face. "You needed help. I gave it. That's what decent people do." A smile flickered across his face, transforming his stern features into something almost gentle. Decent people don't sacrifice their own survival for strangers. What you did goes far beyond decency. It's extraordinary. He took the blanket and wrapped it around himself, then moved closer. My name is Kieran Nightshade. I'm the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The Alpha King. She'd been feeding and sheltering the Alpha King for a week. The most powerful shifter in existence had been dying on her porch, and she treated him like any other starving wolf. I didn't know, she managed, her mind reeling. Your Majesty, if I'd realized who you were. If you'd realized who I was, would you have acted differently? Kieran interrupted gently. Sarah thought about it honestly. No, she admitted. You were starving. You needed help. Your rank wouldn't have changed that. Exactly, Kieran said, satisfaction warming his voice. You helped because it was the right thing to do, not because of who we might be. That's rare, Sarah Whitlock. Rarer than you know. She blinked in surprise. You know my name. How? I know more than your name. I know you walked away from the Silvercrest Pack 2 years ago rather than accept a mating you didn't want. I know you've been living alone on this mountain, surviving on your own terms. I know you're an Omega with more courage than most alphas I've met. He took another step closer. And I know that the moment you opened your door to feed 12 dying wolves, you changed everything. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the air in the cabin began to crackle again. One by one, the other wolves started to shift, their alpha's successful transformation giving them the strength they needed to follow. Within minutes, Sarah's small cabin was filled with 11 naked people, all looking at her with expressions of gratitude and respect. A woman with silver-tipped hair, the same wolf Sarah had fed first, spoke up. My name is Elena Frost. I'm the Alpha King's second in command. She bowed deeply. You have our eternal gratitude, Luna Sarah. I'm not a Luna, Sarah protested automatically. I'm not part of any pack. I'm just someone who lives alone and happened to have food when you needed it. You fed the Alpha King and his inner circle for a week, Elena said with a slight smile. You sacrificed your own survival for ours. That makes you more worthy of the title Luna than many who wear it officially. Kieran raised his hand, and Elena fell silent immediately. He turned back to Sarah, his amber eyes intense. We need to talk about what happens next, but first, my people need to rest and recover fully. Is there somewhere nearby where we could establish a temporary camp? Somewhere that would give us access to game for hunting? Sarah thought quickly. There's a valley about a mile north of here. It's sheltered from the worst of the wind, and there's usually good hunting. Elk migrate through there in winter. Perfect, Kieran said. Elena, take the others and scout the valley. Set up camp and start hunting. We need to build our strength back up. He paused, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. I'll stay here for now. Sarah and I have things to discuss. The others filed out, some still wrapping themselves in blankets from Sarah's bed, all of them bowing to her before they left. Within minutes, the cabin was empty, except for Sarah and Kieran, the silence suddenly heavy with unspoken tension. You're wondering why the Alpha King and his inner circle were starving in the wilderness, Kieran said, reading her expression accurately. You're wondering what could possibly drive us to that point of desperation. The thought had crossed my mind, Sarah admitted, trying to ignore how aware she was of his presence in her small space. Even weakened, even wrapped in a blanket instead of proper clothes, he radiated power that made her Omega nature want to submit. We were betrayed, Kieran said bluntly. Someone in my court, someone I trusted, poisoned us during a winter hunt. The poison didn't kill us, but it prevented us from shifting back to human form and made us too weak to hunt effectively. We've been running for 3 weeks, trying to reach my territory before we died of starvation. He moved to stand by the fire, staring into the flames. We would have died if you hadn't found us. My entire inner circle, the Alphas who keep the Northern Territories safe, would have been wiped out. The power vacuum would have started wars that could have killed thousands. You didn't just save our lives, Sarah. You saved the kingdom. Sarah sat down heavily, trying to process this information. Who betrayed you? I don't know yet, Kieran admitted. But I'm going to find out, and when I do, they'll wish they'd died in that storm instead of facing my judgment. The coldness in his voice made Sarah shiver, reminding her that this man wasn't just powerful, he was dangerous. An Alpha King didn't become ruler of the Northern Territories by being kind. He became ruler by being stronger, smarter, and more ruthless than everyone else. What are you going to do now? She asked. Recover my strength, return to my territory, and root out the traitor, Kieran said. Then he turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made Sarah's heart skip a beat. But first, I'm going to address something that's been bothering me since the moment I regained consciousness in your cabin. What's that? Sarah asked warily. The mate bond, Kieran said simply, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. The one that formed between us sometime during the week you spent saving my life. The one you can feel right now, even if you're trying to ignore it. Sarah opened her mouth to deny it, but the words died in her throat. Because he was right. She could feel it, had been feeling it for days without understanding what it was. That pull toward him, that warmth in her chest when he was near, that absolute certainty that he was important in ways that had nothing to do with his rank or power. The mate bond. But that was impossible. She'd refused a mating to Marcus Thornhill specifically because she hadn't felt any bond with him, had known deep in her soul that he wasn't her true mate. She'd walked away from her pack rather than accept a false bond, and now the Alpha King was telling her that the true bond had formed between them. I don't understand, Sarah whispered. How could the bond form while you were in wolf form? Because bonds form between souls, not bodies, Kieran explained gently. My wolf recognized you as mate, and when you spent a week showing my pack kindness and compassion without asking for anything in return, showing me the person you truly are, the bond solidified. He took a step toward her. I felt it the moment I shifted back, that undeniable pull. That absolute certainty that you're mine and I'm yours. But I'm nobody, Sarah protested, falling back on old arguments. I'm a rogue Omega, with no pack, no status, no political value. You're the Alpha King. You need a mate who can help you rule, not someone who lives alone on a mountain. I need a mate who would sacrifice her own survival to help strangers, Kieran corrected firmly. I need someone who sees wolves as living beings worthy of compassion, not political assets to be manipulated. I need a partner who makes decisions based on what's right instead of what's advantageous. He moved closer, close enough that Sarah could feel the heat radiating from his body. You think status matters? Political value? I've had 100 offers from high-ranking females who could bring me alliances and power, but not one of them would have opened their door to 12 dying wolves. Not one of them would have given away their food knowing it might mean their own death. That kind of character can't be bought or taught, Sarah. It just is. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. I don't know how to be a queen. I don't know anything about politics or court intrigue or ruling territories. I walked away from pack life because I couldn't handle the expectations of being a simple beta's mate. How could I possibly handle being Luna to the entire Northern Kingdom? The same way you handled finding 12 dying wolves on your porch, Kieran said, with a slight smile, by trusting your instincts and doing what feels right, even when it's terrifying. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently took her hand. The moment their skin touched, the mate bond flared between them with an intensity that made Sarah gasp. It was nothing like what she'd felt with Marcus, that vague sense of obligation. This was fire and lightning and coming home to a place she'd never been, but had always been searching for. "I'm not asking you to decide everything right now," Kieran said softly, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I'm not demanding you accept the bond immediately or agree to be my queen. I'm just asking you to acknowledge what exists between us, to admit that this is real." Sarah looked up into those amber eyes and saw something that surprised her. Vulnerability. This powerful alpha, this king who commanded entire territories, was standing in her cabin looking at her like she held his entire future in her hands, like her choice mattered more than anything else in his world. "It's real," she whispered, finally admitting what she'd been trying to deny. "I can feel it. But Kieran, I'm terrified. What if I'm not strong enough for this? What if I fail you?" "Then we'll fail together and learn from it," Kieran replied, echoing words she'd once heard in a different context. "But Sarah, I've lived for over 300 years. I've met thousands of wolves, ruled over hundreds of packs. And in all that time, I've never met anyone who made me feel the way you do. Someone who makes me want to be better, to build a kingdom worthy of her compassion instead of one built on fear and power." He brought her hand to his chest, pressing it against his heart. "The mate bond doesn't lie. It doesn't make mistakes. The moon goddess chose you for me, and I'm choosing to trust her judgment." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a wall crumbling that she'd built around her heart after leaving Silvercrest. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to process this, to understand what it means. But I'm not saying no. I'm saying let me see who you are outside of this crisis. Let me know the man, not just the king." Relief flooded Kieran's features. "That's more than I dared hope for. Take all the time you need, Sarah. I'll be here." A thought occurred to her suddenly. The betrayer. If someone in your court tried to kill you, going back might be walking into a trap. How do you know they won't try again? Kieran's expression hardened. "They'll try, which is why I need to return with enough strength to face them and smart enough to identify them before they strike again. But you raise a good point. I can't just walk back into court and pretend nothing happened. Whoever did this thinks I'm dead. That gives me an advantage I need to use wisely." "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, recognizing the calculating look in his eyes. "I'm thinking that the Alpha King died in the wilderness," Kieran said slowly, "along with his entire inner circle. That's what the betrayer believes, and I'm going to let them keep believing it while I investigate from the shadows." He started pacing, his strategic mind clearly working through possibilities. "Elena and the others can pose as rogue wolves seeking sanctuary in various packs throughout the territory. They'll listen, gather information, identify who's been making moves to fill the power vacuum. Meanwhile, He stopped, his eyes landing on Sarah with sudden intensity. "You'll what?" she prompted, though something in her gut already knew what he was about to say. "I'll stay here," Kieran said, "with you, as a rogue alpha seeking shelter for the winter, nothing more. No one knows about this cabin except us. No one would think to look for the Alpha King living quietly on a mountain with a rogue Omega." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Having Kieran stay meant spending months in close quarters with her mate, navigating the bond between them, while he was essentially in hiding. It meant risk, danger, if they were discovered. But it also meant time, the time she'd just asked for to know him as a man instead of a king. The storm destroyed most of the game trails, she said slowly, thinking out loud. Hunting will be nearly impossible for weeks. Your people will need to spread out to survive anyway. It actually makes sense strategically. It does, Kieran agreed, watching her carefully. But I'm not going to pretend that's my only motivation. I want to stay here, Sarah. I want time with you away from politics and expectations and the weight of the crown. I want to know the woman who saved my life, not as her king, but as a man who's found his mate after centuries of searching. The honesty in his voice made Sarah's decision easier. Then stay. Help me survive the winter. Help me figure out how to keep us both fed with my stores nearly gone. Be Kieran, not the Alpha King, and we'll see what develops between us. The smile that spread across Kieran's face was radiant. Thank you for everything, for saving us, for giving us shelter, for giving me a chance I don't deserve. You deserved help when you were dying, Sarah corrected. Whether you deserve anything more than that, well, I guess we'll find out together. Over the next few days, a new routine established itself. Elena and the others set up camp in the valley, far enough away to give Sarah and Kieran privacy, but close enough to provide protection, if needed. They hunted successfully, bringing back enough meat to replenish Sarah's stores and ensure everyone would survive the winter. Kieran proved to be surprisingly useful around the cabin. He repaired the shed that had been damaged in the storm, reinforced the walls against the brutal cold, and chopped enough wood to last until spring. He was strong, efficient, and completely unconcerned with the fact that this kind of manual labor was supposedly beneath an Alpha King's dignity. I wasn't always royalty, he explained one afternoon as they worked together to smoke the meat Elena had brought. I was born into a mid-ranking pack, earned my position through strength and strategy. I haven't forgotten what it means to work for survival. Sarah watched him work, noting the easy competence in his movements, the way he approached each task with focus and determination. This was different from the commanding Alpha who'd revealed himself in her cabin. This was someone grounded, practical, real. They fell into easy conversation during the long winter evenings, sitting by the fire while the wind howled outside. Kieran told her about his life, about becoming Alpha of his birth pack at 25, about the challenges that led him to challenge the previous king and take the crown at 150. He spoke about the loneliness of leadership, the weight of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, the constant threat of betrayal and violence. You asked why I never found my mate before now, he said one night, staring into the flames. The truth is, I stopped believing she existed. 300 years is a long time to search, Sarah. After the first century, I convinced myself the moon goddess had simply decided I didn't deserve that kind of happiness, that my purpose was to rule, not to love. And now? Sarah asked softly. Now I know I was wrong, Kieran replied, turning to look at her with such intensity that her breath caught. She was just waiting for the right time, the right circumstances, waiting for me to be humbled enough to accept help from a stranger, to see value in someone the world had overlooked. He reached out and took her hand, the gesture becoming familiar between them. You saved my life, Sarah. But more than that, you reminded me why life is worth saving in the first place. Sarah felt the mate bond pulse between them, stronger now than it had been days ago. Being near Kieran constantly, learning about him, seeing who he was when he wasn't performing the role of king, it was making the bond deepen in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying. But she also shared herself with him, telling him about her childhood in Silvercrest, about feeling like she never quite fit the mold of what an Omega should be. Too independent, too willing to question authority, too focused on what felt right instead of what was expected. Marcus wasn't wrong when he rejected me, she admitted one night. I would have made a terrible beta's mate. I can't perform the role people expect, can't smile and nod and support decisions I think are wrong. That's why I left. I'd rather be alone than spend my life pretending to be someone I'm not. You're not alone anymore, Kieran said gently. And I don't want you to pretend to be anything other than exactly who you are. That's the woman I'm falling in love with, Sarah. The one who questions, who challenges, who does what's right even when it's hard. That's exactly what a true queen should be. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Love. He'd said love, not just the mate bond, not just biological compatibility, but actual emotional connection. Sarah looked at him, at this man who'd spent weeks chopping her wood and hunting her food and sitting by her fire like it was exactly where he wanted to be, and felt her own carefully constructed walls finally crumble completely. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered, even though it terrifies me, even though I don't know how to be what you need. I'm falling anyway. Kieran pulled her close, and when he kissed her, it felt like everything in the universe had aligned perfectly. The mate bond blazed between them, but underneath it was something deeper, something built on weeks of conversation and shared work and genuine understanding. This wasn't just fate bringing them together. This was choice, conscious and deliberate, to build something real. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Something about the betrayal, about why I think it happened. Sarah pulled back slightly to look at his face. What is it? There's been pressure on me for years to take a chosen mate, Kieran explained. Several high-ranking families have daughters they've been pushing toward me, trying to secure a connection to the throne. I've refused every offer because none of them felt right, because I was still holding out hope for a true mate bond. His jaw tightened. I think someone got tired of waiting. I think the poisoning was meant to eliminate me so they could install a puppet king, someone who would marry their daughter and give them control of the northern territories. The political implications made Sarah's head spin. If that's true, then going back means walking into a situation where powerful families want you dead. It does, Kieran agreed, which is why I can't go back alone, and why I can't go back weak. When I return to court, I need to return with unshakable strength, and with my mate bond publicly acknowledged. The families plotting against me need to know that their schemes have failed, that I'm not only alive but bonded to someone they can't control or manipulate. He cupped her face gently. But I won't ask you to step into that danger unless you're ready, unless you're certain this is what you want. Sarah thought about her quiet life, on the mountain, about the solitude she'd chosen to escape pack politics. Going with Kieran meant giving all of that up, stepping into a world of intrigue and danger, where people would literally kill to advance their agendas. It meant becoming exactly what she'd run from, a political figure with responsibilities and expectations. But it also meant standing beside the man she loved, using her voice and her values to influence how an entire kingdom was ruled. It meant the chance to build something better than what she'd left behind. I'm certain, Sarah said, meeting his eyes with a conviction that surprised even herself. I'm terrified, but I'm certain. Because you're right about one thing. I spent 2 years hiding on this mountain because I was afraid of being controlled, afraid of losing myself to someone else's expectations. But being with you doesn't feel like losing myself. It feels like finally becoming who I was always meant to be. She took his hand and pressed it against her chest, over her heart. I choose you, Kieran. I choose us. And I choose to fight for a kingdom that values compassion as much as strength. Whatever danger we're walking into, we face it together. The kiss he gave her then was different from the first, deeper, claiming, sealing a promise that went beyond words. When they broke apart, both glowing with the mate bond's energy, Kieran's eyes were bright with emotion. We have until spring, he said. 3 months to prepare, to plan, to make you strong enough to face what's coming. Because make no mistake, Sarah, the moment we walk into that court, you'll be targeted. They'll try to discredit you, dismiss you, possibly even harm you. We need to make sure you're ready. Over the following weeks, Kieran began teaching Sarah everything she'd need to know, not just about court politics and protocol, but about her own power as an Omega and as a mate to the Alpha King. Your instinct saved my life, he explained one morning as they stood in the clearing behind her cabin. The compassion, that ability to see what's needed and act without hesitation, that's not weakness. It's the rarest form of strength. But you need to learn how to wield it deliberately, how to use your Omega nature as a tool, rather than letting others use it against you. He taught her about pack bonds, about how an Omega's influence could spread through an entire territory if she knew how to channel it properly. He showed her how to project calm in moments of chaos, how to sense deception in others, how to use her natural empathy as a weapon when necessary. The families plotting against us will expect you to be meek and submissive, Kieran said. They'll think a rogue Omega with no political training will be easy to manipulate or intimidate. We're going to shatter those expectations so completely that they'll never see the real threat coming. Sarah absorbed everything like a sponge, but she also pushed back when Kieran's strategies veered too far into pure manipulation. I won't. Become the kind of person who uses others' emotions against them just because I can, she insisted during one particularly heated discussion. If we're building something better, it has to start with us, with how we treat even our enemies. Kieran studied her for a long moment, then smiled with genuine admiration. You're right, and that's exactly why you'll be a better queen than I ever could be a king alone. You keep me honest, Sarah. Keep me focused on what matters instead of just what works. Meanwhile, Elena and the others continued their reconnaissance missions, traveling to various packs throughout the territory and sending back reports through carefully coded messages. The news they gathered was both enlightening and disturbing. In Kieran's absence, 3 families had emerged as primary contenders for power. The Blackwoods, led by matriarch Vivian, who had been pushing her daughter Cassandra as a potential mate for Kieran for years. The Iron Fangs, a military family with enough armed wolves to stage a coup if they chose. And the Silverstones, merchant wolves with wealth beyond measure and connections throughout the kingdom. All 3 families were quietly positioning themselves for when the official announcement came that the Alpha King was dead. But here's what's interesting, Elena reported during one of her secret visits to the cabin. None of them are working together. They're all pursuing separate agendas, which means whoever poisoned you is operating alone or with a very small group. They're keeping their victory quiet, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. Kieran processed this information with the strategic mind that had made him king. They can't announce my death without a body, and they can't produce a body because I'm not dead. So they're stuck in a holding pattern, trying to consolidate power without openly claiming the throne. He looked at Sarah with fierce determination. Which gives us the opening we need. When we return, it won't just be the Alpha King coming back from the dead. It will be the Alpha King with his true mate, stronger and more unified than they can imagine. The The shock alone will make them vulnerable. As winter deepened and the mountain became a fortress of ice and snow, Sarah found herself transforming in ways she'd never anticipated. Under Kieran's guidance, she discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her Omega abilities, which she'd always seen as making her weak and overly emotional, became finely tuned instruments. She could walk into a room and immediately sense the emotional currents, identify who was afraid and who was angry, who was lying and who was sincere. More than that, she learned how to influence those emotions subtly, calming tensions before they escalated or amplifying loyalty in those who were already inclined to support them. "You're a natural," Kieran told her after she'd successfully navigated a mock negotiation with Elena playing the role of a hostile alpha. "The way you read people, the way you adapt your approach to what each individual needs, it's not something that can be taught. That's pure instinct refined by intelligence." But it wasn't all political training. The winter also gave them time to simply be together, to build the foundation of their relationship beyond the urgency of crisis and danger. They spent long evenings talking about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts, dreams for their future, fears they'd never voiced to anyone else. Kieran told her about the weight of immortality, about watching generations of wolves live and die, while he remained unchanged, about the loneliness of never having someone who truly understood the burden of leadership. Sarah shared her own fears, about never feeling like she belonged anywhere, about the shame of being seen as defective by her birth pack, about the terror of opening her heart to someone who could reject her the way Marcus had. "The difference," Kieran said gently, "is that Marcus was never your true mate. The bond you felt with him was manufactured, expected, forced. But what we have is chosen by the moon goddess herself. I couldn't reject you even if I wanted to, Sarah, and I will never want to." The mate bond between them continued to deepen, but they took things slowly, building trust before passion, ensuring that when they finally completed the bond, it would be because they both chose it completely, not because biology demanded it. When they did finally come together on a night when northern lights danced across the sky, and the world seemed to hold its breath, it was perfect in ways that transcended the physical. The bond sealed with a flash of power that lit up the cabin and sent waves of energy rippling through the valley, strong enough that Elena and the others felt it from their camp and knew immediately what it meant. Their alpha king had found his true mate, and the balance of power in the northern territories had just shifted irrevocably. The next morning, Sarah woke wrapped in Kieran's arms with the mate mark fresh on her neck and a sense of completeness she'd never experienced before. "How do you feel?" Kieran murmured against her hair. "Like I could take on the world," Sarah replied honestly. "Like nothing they throw at us will be enough to break what we've built." "Good," Kieran said with satisfaction, "because spring is coming, and with it, our return. Are you ready?" Sarah thought about the woman she'd been at the start of winter, alone and isolated, convinced she was better off without pack connections. She thought about the woman she'd become, strong and confident, loved and valued, ready to fight for a better future. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's go take back your kingdom." As the snow began to melt and the first signs of spring appeared, Elena and the others returned to the cabin for a final strategy session. They'd spent months gathering intelligence, identifying allies and enemies, mapping out the political landscape they'd be entering. "The Blackwoods are the most dangerous," Elena reported, spreading out a hand-drawn map of the territory on Sarah's table. Vivian has been quietly consolidating support among the noble families, promising favors and positions in exchange for loyalty. If we're not careful, she'll have enough backing to challenge your claim to the throne. The Iron Fangs have the military strength, added Marcus Shadowpelt, one of Kieran's most trusted warriors. They've been recruiting aggressively, building their forces under the guise of protecting the territory during the power vacuum. They could stage a coup if they wanted to. And the Silverstones have the money, finished Lydia Moonwhisper, Elena's second. They've been buying influence, funding various factions, playing all sides against each other. They're positioned to come out on top no matter who wins. Kieran studied the map with calculating eyes. So we have 3 major threats, all operating independently, but all working toward the same goal, controlling the throne. The question is, which one of them poisoned us? My money's on the Blackwoods, Elena said. Vivian has the most to gain directly. If you died, she could have pushed forward a different Alpha King, someone willing to mate with Cassandra, instant access to the throne. But the Iron Fangs have the means, Marcus countered. Military wolves would have access to the kind of poison used, and they'd know how to deploy it without being detected. Don't discount the Silverstones, Lydia added. Money can buy anything, including silence and expertise. They could have hired someone to do it and kept themselves completely clean. Sarah listened to the debate, her newly honed instincts picking up nuances the others might miss. What if we're looking at this wrong, she said quietly, and everyone turned to look at her. What if it wasn't about gaining the throne directly? What if it was about creating chaos? Kieran's eyes sharpened with interest. Explain. Think about it, Sarah continued, standing to pace as her thoughts crystallized. If you died, the 3 families would immediately start fighting for control. That conflict would weaken the kingdom, potentially start a civil war. And who benefits most from a weakened northern territory? The southern kingdoms, Kieran breathed, understanding dawning in his eyes. They've been looking for an opening to expand north for decades. If we were torn apart by internal conflict, they could march in and claim territory, while we were too busy fighting each other to defend our borders. Which means the poisoning might not have come from within our own court at all, Elena said, her expression grave. It could have been a foreign agent, someone working for the South. The implications were staggering. If their enemy wasn't one of the 3 families but an outside force working to destabilize the kingdom, then returning to court meant walking into a situation even more complex and dangerous than they'd anticipated. We need proof, Kieran said decisively. We can't just accuse the southern kingdoms without evidence. But if Sarah's right, and I think she might be, then our strategy needs to change. We're not just fighting for the throne, we're fighting to prevent a war. Over the next few weeks, they refined their plan. Kieran would return to court during the spring equinox celebration, a major gathering where all the noble families would be present. He'd reveal himself publicly, announce his mating to Syrah, and immediately begin the process of rooting out the conspiracy. But they wouldn't go in blind. Elena and the others would arrive separately, posing as representatives from various packs, positioning themselves to gather information and provide support when needed. Sarah would be introduced not as a rogue Omega, but as a wolf speaker, a rare gift that commanded respect across all pack hierarchies. They'd researched her family history and discovered that her grandmother's line included documented wolf speakers going back 5 generations, a heritage that had been suppressed in Silvercrest because the pack leadership hadn't known how to handle someone with that kind of power. It's perfect, Kieran said with satisfaction. Wolf speakers are revered, almost sacred in Northern tradition. The noble families won't be able to dismiss you as just some rogue I picked up. They'll have to acknowledge your value, your right to stand beside me. And if they try to harm me? Sarah asked, not out of fear but practical planning. Then they'll face me, Kieran replied, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha king. And they'll learn very quickly that threatening my mate is the last mistake they'll ever make. The night before they were set to leave, Sarah stood on her cabin porch looking out at the mountain that had been her home for 2 years. This small space had represented freedom, safety, a refuge from the demands of pack life. Now she was walking away from it, heading into the most dangerous situation of her life. But she wasn't afraid. She was ready. Kieran came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. Second thoughts? He asked quietly. Not even for a moment, Sarah replied, leaning into his warmth. Though I'll miss this place. The quiet, the simplicity. We'll come back, Kieran promised. When things settle, when the kingdom is secure, we'll return here. Keep the cabin as a retreat, somewhere we can escape when the politics get too heavy. This will always be ours, Sarah, the place where everything began. The journey to the royal court took 5 days, traveling through terrain that was slowly waking from winter's grip. They moved carefully, avoiding main roads and populated areas, not wanting to announce their presence before the equinox celebration. Along the way, Sarah got her first real glimpse of the kingdom she'd be helping to rule. Small villages where wolves lived in close-knit communities, working together to survive. Vast forests teeming with game and wild beauty. Mountain ranges that took her breath away with their majesty. It's incredible, she said, as they crested a ridge overlooking a valley where hundreds of wolves lived in harmony. I never realized how vast the territory was, how many people depend on strong leadership. 50,000 wolves call the Northern Territories home, Kieran told her, spread across hundreds of packs, all looking to the Alpha King to keep them safe, to settle disputes, to maintain order. That's the weight I carry, Sarah, the responsibility for all of their lives. He looked at her with profound seriousness. And now you'll carry it with me. Are you ready for that? Sarah thought about the 12 wolves who'd collapsed on her porch, about the choice she'd made to help them despite the cost to herself. She thought about the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. I'm ready, she said. Not because I think I have all the answers, but because I care enough to find them. Because I'll fight for these people the same way I fought to keep you alive, with everything I have. They arrived at the royal compound on the morning of the spring equinox, timing their entrance for maximum impact. The celebration was already underway, with wolves from every major pack gathered in the great courtyard, dressed in their finest clothes and engaged in the kind of political maneuvering that Sarah had always despised. From their hidden vantage point in the trees surrounding the compound, they could see the 3 families Elena had identified. The Blackwoods occupied the eastern pavilion, matriarch Vivian holding court with her daughter Cassandra at her side. The Iron Fangs had taken the southern section, their warriors standing at attention in formation that was clearly meant to intimidate. The Silverstones mingled throughout the crowd, their merchant instincts making them natural networkers. They're all here, Elena reported, having arrived 2 days earlier to scout the situation. And they're all waiting for the council to make an official announcement about your death. The rumor is they'll do it tonight, during the feast. Perfect, Kieran said with a predatory smile. Nothing quite like a dramatic resurrection to make a point. He turned to Sarah, taking both her hands. Last chance to back out. Once we walk through those gates, there's no going back to the simple life." "The simple life was lonely," Sarah replied firmly. "This is where I'm meant to be. Let's show them what we're made of." They waited until the afternoon feast was in full swing, when all the noble families were gathered in the great hall. Then Kieran and Sarah walked through the main gates, hand in hand, the mate bond blazing between them like a beacon that every wolf in the vicinity could feel. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Guards at the gate fell to their knees, shock and submission. Wolves in the courtyard began crying out in recognition and disbelief. By the time Kieran and Sarah reached the great hall doors, a crowd had formed, following them with expressions ranging from joy to horror. Kieran pushed open the doors with both hands, the crash echoing through the hall and silencing every conversation instantly. Hundreds of wolves turned to stare, and Sarah felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. But she kept her head high, her hand firm in Kieran's, her Omega nature calm and centered, despite the chaos of emotions swirling around them. "I hear rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated," Kieran said, into the shocked silence, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of an Alpha King. He walked forward, Sarah at his side, moving through the crowd that parted before them like water. "Allow me to introduce my true mate, Sarah Whitlock, Wolf Speaker and Luna of the Northern Territories. She saved my life when I was poisoned and left to die in the wilderness. She sheltered me and my inner circle through the brutal winter, and she has agreed to stand beside me as we root out the conspiracy that nearly destroyed this kingdom." The explosion of noise was deafening. Questions shouted from every direction, denials and accusations flying, some wolves dropping to their knees in submission while others stood frozen in shock. Sarah scanned the crowd with her newly trained senses, looking for the telltale signs of guilt. And there, in the back of the hall, she saw it, a flicker of pure panic crossing the face of a wolf she didn't recognize, a minor noble wearing Silverstone colors. He was already backing toward a side exit, clearly planning to flee. "Kieran," she murmured, nodding toward the man, "southeast corner, trying to run." Kieran's eyes followed her indication, and he made a sharp gesture to Elena, who'd been waiting for just such a signal. She and Marcus moved with supernatural speed, cutting off the man's escape route and dragging him forward through the crowd. "Ambassador Thornwald," Kieran said coldly, as the man was forced to his knees before the high table. "How interesting that you'd try to flee the moment I returned from the dead. One might almost think you had something to hide." "Your Majesty, I was simply startled," Thornwald stammered, his face pale with fear. "I never expected to see you alive. No one did. We were told you died in the wilderness." "Told by whom?" Kieran demanded, his alpha power pressing down so heavily that several nearby wolves whimpered in submission. "Who gave you that information, Ambassador?" Thornwald's resistance crumbled under the combined weight of Kieran's dominance and his own terror. "The Southern King sent word. He said he had reliable intelligence that you'd been killed by rogues. He offered the Silverstones exclusive trading rights if we supported his claim that the Northern Territories needed outside intervention to maintain stability." The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. The Southern King had orchestrated the poisoning, probably using Thornwald as his agent, with the goal of creating enough chaos to justify a Southern invasion. The Silverstones had been manipulated into supporting the narrative, probably without realizing they were being used. "Treason," Kieran said softly, but his voice carried through the silent hall like a death sentence. "You conspired with a foreign power to destabilize this kingdom." You helped poison your own Alpha King. What do you have to say for yourself?" Thornwald collapsed completely, breaking down into sobs. "Mercy, Your Majesty. I was promised gold, position, safety for my family. I didn't think you'd actually die. The Southern King said the poison would just make you sick enough to seem weak, vulnerable. I didn't know it would nearly kill you." "But it did nearly kill me," Kieran said, his voice like ice. "Along with 12 of my most trusted wolves. We would have died if not for the compassion of one rogue Omega who sacrificed everything to save us." He looked at Matriarch Vivian and the leaders of the other families. This is what happens when ambition overrides loyalty, when foreign gold is valued more than kingdom honor. Ambassador Thornwald will face trial for treason. The Silverstone family will be investigated for their role in this conspiracy, and every wolf in this kingdom will understand that such betrayal will never be tolerated again. The hall erupted into chaos again, but this time it was different. The shock was wearing off, replaced by anger at the betrayal and relief that their king had returned. Sarah watched as Kieran efficiently took control of the situation, issuing orders to Elena and the others, calling for formal investigations, restoring order through sheer force of will and authority. This was the king the Northern Territories needed, strong and decisive, but also just and measured. And she was standing beside him, his mate and partner, exactly where she was meant to be. Over the following weeks, the truth came out in full. Thornwald had been recruited by Southern agents years ago, slowly corrupted by promises of wealth and power. The poison had been delivered through a specially prepared wine served during the winter hunt, affecting only Kieran and the specific wolves who'd been targeted. The goal had been exactly what Sarah had suspected, to create chaos that would justify Southern intervention. The Silverstone family was cleared of direct involvement, but censured for their willingness to accept Southern intelligence without question. The Blackwoods and Iron Fangs, while guilty of opportunism in Kieran's absence, were found to have had no role in the actual conspiracy. Thornwald was executed for treason, and new safeguards were put in place to prevent foreign infiltration. But perhaps most importantly, Kieran used the crisis to fundamentally reshape how the kingdom operated. Working with Sarah, he established new councils that gave voice to lower-ranking wolves, created systems for reporting corruption without fear of retaliation, and began building alliances based on mutual respect rather than fear or obligation. "You were right," he told Sarah one night, as they stood on the balcony of the royal chambers, looking out over the territory they now ruled together. "About building something better, about leading with compassion instead of just strength. The old ways were creating the conditions for betrayal. We needed this wake-up call." Sarah leaned against him, feeling the mate bond hum contentedly between them. "We're not done yet. There's still so much work to do, so many wolves who need help, so many systems that need changing." "Then it's a good thing we have centuries to do it," Kieran replied, pulling her close. "You and me, building something that will last long after we're gone." 6 months after their return to court, Sarah stood in the great hall once again, but this time it was filled with joy instead of chaos. The formal mating ceremony was being held, witnessed by thousands of wolves who'd come from across the territory to celebrate their Alpha King's union with his true mate. Sarah wore a gown of silver and white, her wolf speaker heritage honored in the traditional designs embroidered into the fabric. Kieran stood beside her in formal regalia, looking every inch the powerful king he was. But when he looked at her, his eyes held only love and admiration. "I, Kieran Nightshade, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, claim you, Sarah Whitlock, as my true mate before the moon goddess and all witnesses, Hiko. When, he said, his voice strong and clear, I vow to honor you, protect you, stand beside you as we build a kingdom worthy of your compassion and strength. I vow to love you for all my days, to value your voice and your wisdom, to be the partner you deserve. Sarah's voice was equally strong as she made her own vows. I, Sarah Whitlock, Wolf Speaker and Luna of the Northern Territories, claim you, Kieran Nightshade, as my true mate before the moon goddess and all witnesses. I vow to stand beside you in times of peace and war, to challenge you when you stray from what's right, to support you when the weight of leadership becomes too heavy. I vow to love you for all my days, to use my gifts in service of our people, to be the partner you need and the queen this kingdom deserves. When they sealed their vows with a kiss, the mate bond blazed so brightly that every wolf in the hall could see the golden light surrounding them. The moon goddess herself seemed to bless their union, and even the cynics in the crowd had to acknowledge that this was a true pairing, blessed and ordained by powers beyond their understanding. The celebration lasted 3 days, and wolves from every pack in the territory came to pay their respects and offer their loyalty. But the moment Sarah treasured most came on the final night, when an elderly Omega approached her with tears streaming down her face. Thank you, the woman whispered, bowing deeply. Thank you for showing us that Omegas can be strong, that we can lead, that we matter. My granddaughter watched you stand before the court, and for the first time in her life, she believed she could be something more than what others expected. You've changed everything, Luna Sarah. You've given us hope. That night, as Sarah lay in Kieran's arms in their private chambers, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from rejected and isolated to Luna of an entire kingdom, from believing she was broken to understanding she was exactly what the world needed. What are you thinking? Kieran murmured sleepily. I'm thinking about 12 wolves dying on my porch, Sarah replied quietly. About the choice I made to help them, even though it might have killed me. About how one moment of compassion changed absolutely everything. The moon goddess works in mysterious ways, Kieran said, pulling her closer. She knew exactly what she was doing when she led us to your cabin, when she brought us together. Do you think we would have found each other if the poisoning hadn't happened? Sarah asked. If you hadn't been desperate enough to approach a rogue Omega's cabin? Kieran was quiet for a long moment, considering. I like to think so. I like to think that somehow, some way, we would have found each other. But I'm grateful it happened the way it did, because it showed me who you really are. Not a political figure trying to impress me, but a person who feeds starving wolves without asking what she'll get in return. That's the woman I fell in love with, Sarah. That's the queen this kingdom needs. Sarah smiled in the darkness, feeling complete in ways she'd never imagined possible. She'd spent 2 years on that mountain believing she was better off alone. That connection meant losing herself. But she'd been wrong. Real connection, the kind built on mutual respect and genuine love, didn't diminish you. It made you stronger, more yourself than you'd ever been before. And as for the 12 wolves who'd shown up on her porch that stormy night, they'd given her everything. A mate, a purpose, a kingdom to help guide toward something better. All because she'd chosen kindness over self-preservation, compassion over practicality. Years later, when young Omegas would come to Queen Sarah seeking guidance, feeling lost or broken or worthless, she'd take them to the portrait that hung in the great hall, It showed a woman in simple clothing standing in front of a small cabin, surrounded by 12 wolves, her hand extended in offering. "That's the moment everything changed, she'd tell them. "Not when I became queen, not when I was recognized as wolf speaker, but when I chose to help creatures who needed me even though it might cost me everything. Real strength isn't about power or dominance. It's about choosing compassion even when it's difficult, about seeing value in others, even when the world says they're worthless. That's what makes a true leader. That's what makes someone worthy." And if those young Omegas left standing a little taller, believing for the first time that they too could be something more, then Sarah knew she'd fulfilled her purpose. She'd become the person she'd needed when she was lost and alone, hiding on a mountain, convinced she was better off without pack bonds. The rogue Omega, who'd fed 12 starving wolves, had discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple act of kindness. Sometimes saving a stranger changes the entire world. And sometimes the broken, rejected wolf, who thinks she's worthless, turns out to be exactly what a kingdom needs to heal. Sarah Whitlock had started that winter believing she was nobody, just a rogue Omega with nothing to offer. She ended it as a queen, a mate, a leader who would reshape the northern territories through compassion and wisdom. And it all began because she couldn't leave living creatures to die on her porch, even when every practical instinct told her to save herself. The 12 wolves had been dying when they found her cabin, but in saving them, Sarah had saved herself, had found her true purpose, had discovered that the very qualities her old pack had called weaknesses were actually her greatest strengths. And the Alpha King who'd collapsed on her porch had found something he'd been searching for across 3 centuries. Not just a mate, but a partner who would challenge him, support him, and help him build a kingdom where compassion mattered as much as power. Their story would be told for generations, the tale of the rogue Omega and the hidden king, of 12 dying wolves and the woman who refused to let them perish, of how one winter storm and one act of extraordinary kindness changed the fate of an entire kingdom. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way, with a reminder that real strength comes from the heart, that true leadership is built on compassion, and that sometimes the most important choice you'll ever make is to help someone who can't repay you, to show kindness when it costs you everything, to choose love over fear and connection over isolation. Because that's when magic happens. That's when destinies align. That's when 12 starving wolves become the catalyst for a love story that would echo through eternity, and a rogue Omega becomes a queen who would change the world.